Welcome to episode 2 of this series, Quickfire. The previous episode, episode 1, we talked about the SNP's pro-independence rhetoric in these documents and their EU rhetoric and the hypocrisies and double standards, frankly, that should be noted. This time, we're going to be talking in specific form about the publication this month, the July publications, arguments around devolution and the Scottish democratic deficit. We're going to be talking about the SNP's claims around that. Now, before we start, I'm going to outline very bluntly how I feel about the SNP's document. I find it risible. I find it amateur and intellectually offensive, and I'll explain why. As we go forward, we shall see the SNP deliberately conflates democratic deficits, needs for reform, with independence, nationalism. Worse than that, what they're doing is arguing that anyone who opposes any critic of independence is somehow denying the need to renew our democracy. It's absolutely appalling. It's undisguised nationalism, tooth and claw, these documents, in regards to the claims made about Scotland's democratic deficit and the need for independence. The fact is, we do not require independence to fix what ails Scottish democracy right now. We'll dig into that more, but we can already think of some things. A change of government in Holyrood would certainly help, but we'll dig into more of that. The SNP's documents link governance issues with, as I say, tawdry, ill-disguised nationalism. They don't address openness, accountability, transparency, reforms to our devolved settlement that could happen now, that could make things better. They don't talk about local government. They don't talk about anything except the need for more powers from a misrepresented Westminster government system. Now, let us begin. There's a lot to unpack. Now, here we go. Excellent. Renewing democracy through independence. July 14th, we're going through this. We're no longer looking at the cheap rhetoric of the First Minister. We're much more interested here. Let us begin with this point here. This is very much a place worth starting. The United Kingdom, at least until now, has been considered a voluntary union of countries. Scotland is a nation, not a region of a unitary state. In line with the principle of self-determination, therefore, the people of Scotland have the right to determine our own future, in the words of the claim of right for Scotland, to choose the form of government best suited to our needs, including whether or not to become an independent country. However, the UK constitutional system is based upon an unlimited sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament. Now, there's so much to unpack here. Let us begin focusing on this. Let us draw a line here. So let us focus on this. This is what I'm most interested in. The unlimited sovereignty of Westminster. This is what they're claiming. It's absolute nonsense, and we should see it for what it is. Because the fact is, the unlimited sovereignty notion, that is to say, Westminster Parliament is supreme, the Crown in Parliament is supreme, Westminster is supreme authority, it is a unitaristic, centralizing, supreme governing level, is bunkum. Of course, the only people that claim this continually are the fetishists around Brexit and the fetishists around independence. As we've seen last episode in relation to the concept of sovereignty, the SNP share that with the Brexiteers, that sovereignty should not be shared up and out above the national level. It has to be hoarded within a country. The SNP also share this nonsense view of the Westminster Parliament. In fact, Nicola Sturgeon and Liz Truss have come, and John Redwood and all these Brexiteers all agree. They're the only ones that agree on this, that the idea that Parliament in London is this supreme authority that can do anything. We know that's not true. If it were, the Westminster government could regulate the economy at will. We know that's not true because globalization demonstrates that the UK government doesn't have anything close to that kind of supreme authority. It's just nonsense. But it's a nonsense that Brexiteers and SNP people like to peddle. But we can see that for what it is. Don't take my word for it. Let's look at some academics who will prove my point. Let's start with McCorkindale. We'll come back to that. Here we are. Now, let's start with McCorkindale. Who is Christopher McCorkindale? Well, he is, I'll show you, Dr. Christopher McCorkindale, Law Department, University of Strathclyde. He's a very, very intelligent man. He knows a lot more about this than certainly Nicola Sturgeon or any of the 20 civil servants who have written this guff. Now, McCorkindale is arguing in relation to the United Kingdom Constitution. Here, the Constitution of the United Kingdom has always been something of a Jekyll and Hyde nature, an internal and uneasy tension between its unitary and union state identities. What does that mean? Well, he's saying that the United Kingdom is not a unitary system alone in isolation. It's a mixture of unitary and union. So this guff that the SNP are peddling here needs to be called out. The idea that Westminster is this unlimited sovereignty, it's not. If it were, we'd be a unitary state, and we're not a unitary state alone in isolation. And McCorkindale does a rather nice job, very succinct call, explaining this mixture of identities between the different aspects. So McCorkindale backs up what I'm saying about that, calling this out, but we can go beyond just Professor Dr. McCorkindale. Let's talk about MacLean and McKellen. Here we are. Ian MacLean, Alistair McKellen. Who are these gentlemen? Well, Ian MacLean is Professor of Politics at Oxford University. He's an author and an extremely intelligent contributor. He's an expert on all of this. And Alistair MacLean is Macmillan, sorry. Alistair Macmillan is postdoctoral research fellow at Oxford University. So these are two people who know what they're talking about. And what do they say? Well, they confirm what McCorkindale said, what I've said, what every serious academic will say to you. The United Kingdom is not a unitary state. Not a unitary state, i.e. Westminster is not this mythical supreme sovereignty, the crown in Parliament. Westminster can do anything it wishes with a vote. This is not the case. Otherwise, it would be a unitary system we live in. Why is the UK not a unitary state? Well, because it depends on two constitutional contracts, the Act of Union of 1707 and 1800. So, what we can say here is the unlimited sovereignty of the Westminster system. Well, why don't we have a think about that in direct terms? What we can say is it is absolute, unremitting guff. There is no unlimited sovereignty. We're not a unitary state. We're a mixture of a unitary and nations. What was the term? Nation state identities. How did McCorkindale put it? Yeah, union state identities. So we're not an unlimited sovereignty. That's the big piece to unload. The SNP are predicating everything they're saying. We need more power. Devolution won't work. It's all a mess. Only independence will work. And they're basing it all on this bunkum the unlimited sovereignty of Westminster. Now, I've showed you McCorkindale, I've showed you Maclean and Macmillan. Let's also look at this professor. This is another professor, my fourth piece of citation, Professor James Mitchell. What does he say? Well, he also confirms that this is bunkum. In this article, he says, this is it here, much of the argument the SNP are putting forward rests on the notion that the current SNP shares with many of its opponents that the Westminster Parliament embodies the notion of unlimited sovereignty to legislate in all matters, free of any constraints from any underpinning principles of international law, human rights, and now also from EU law. This is utterly fanciful. Westminster's unlimited power is a myth shared by Brexiteers, fundamentalist nationalists, blah, blah, blah. So there's four academics of rather good reputation. Professor James Mitchell, Professor Christopher McCorkindale, and Professors Ian Maclean and Alistair Macmillan. So that's a rather big shot through the whole of the neck of the SNP's entire argument here about the need for democratic renewal can only be done through independence. Bunkum, you're predicating it on a completely false notion that Westminster is this unlimited sovereignty. It's not, and no serious academic worthy of the name will tell you it is. Now, the next thing to look at, oh yes, is this issue of devolution. We've looked at the fact that the SNP have based this entire thing about renewal of democracy through independence on the false prospectus that the unitary nature of the United Kingdom, Westminster is this unlimited sovereignty. I showed you four academics that show that that's complete nonsense. So don't take my word for it, take the experts' words for it. Now, the next thing is about devolution. The SNP have tried to sideline it by saying, well, devolution won't work because, hey, London can simply undo everything at the whim. It won't get us to where we need to go. Now, this is very fascinating, but because the bottom line is the SNP would say this, wouldn't they? Because the SNP are a party that have historically opposed to devolution. They have treated it as appeasement. And I'll show you the documents that should prove that that's their words, not mine. That Holyrood, a parliament, an assembly, home rule within the United Kingdom would be appeasement, akin to appeasing a colonial master of sorts. This is what the SNP believed, thought of devolution back in the 70s through the 80s. I'll show the receipts, I'll show you the documents to prove it. So the SNP have never believed in devolution anyway. They didn't want it. And by the time we get to the 90s, they accept the reality of devolution because by 1992, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it'd become irresistible to oppose it. So the SNP adopted what they call the gradualist approach of weaponizing devolution in the same way as they weaponized and continue to weaponize Brexit and the European Union rhetoric and Remainer rhetoric. To remember, episode 1 of the series talks about the EU's weaponization of EU rhetoric and the misrepresentation of Remainer rhetoric and misrepresentation of all of the EU side of this. So let's have a look at the SNP and devolution. Now, in this document, what we can see is the SNP are deliberately trying to argue that devolution won't work. Pledges of more devolution, even if the intention is to deliver, blah, 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 will not work because of the democratic deficit, because the ultimate power would be retained by Westminster. Now, I've already showed you ultimate power of Westminster is bunkum, but they're repeating it again. And why are they so insistent now? Why are they repeating it in connection with devolution? Well, because if devolution is a pathway to reforming the United Kingdom and removing a democratic deficit, why independence? As Professor Mitchell said in his Holyrood article, we don't require independence to fix what ails us. The SNP know this. So they have to create this bogeyman of the ultimate power of London, of Westminster Palace. It's complete bunkum. But the SNP have always opposed devolution. An example of it is up here. It's why I'm quite amused that they reference the claim of right for Scotland. Why? Well, because the SNP opposed the claim of right. Where is the document? There we are. The SNP, this is the document that shows it. The SNP opposed the claim of right. Now, the claim of right, let's talk about that. The claim of right was 1988. It was a publication arguing in favor of home rule without independence, that we should have a parliament or an assembly, that Scotland has a right to decide who and how it's governed. The SNP refused to sign it. They continued to denounce it and refused to endorse it right up until 2012. So the brass neck of the SNP now, in 2022, citing this document in defence of the right of the Scottish people for self-determination, when they refused to sign it in 1988 and refused to have anything to do with it until 2012, is a brass neck, this unbelievable brass neck. And of course, we see it here. The SNP at the time did not sign the claim of right. They are apparently today, Nicola Sturgeon is so obsessed about its importance. The SNP thought it was so unimportant that they refused to sign it in 1988 and 1989. But of course, Miss Sturgeon, a deputy first minister at the time in 2012, just reinvented history, as is her wont, to suddenly say, oh, the SNP, my party, backed the principles of it. Oh, that's convenient. You backed the principles of it, First Minister, did you really? But you never signed the document. The SNP opposed the claim of right. They refused to sign it. They refused to have anything to do with it on the basis that it was merely a devolutionary path forward. And the SNP don't approve of devolution, never have. I can show you this. This is the Scottish Government Yearbook. It is the predecessor to what is now the University of Edinburgh's Scottish Affairs Journal. The predecessor to the Scottish Affairs Journal by the University of Edinburgh in 1990. I dug this up. Highlights the SNP from the 70s through to the early 90s opposed devolution. What did they say about devolution? The refusal of central authorities to countenance any measure of devolution prior to the emergence of the growth of national, blah, blah, blah. The idea devolution was a response to nationalism. Well, yes. But the SNP decided that it was not self-government, but appeasement. That's how the SNP decided to frame this. And if we look through it here, yes, the SNP in 1979 passed a resolution by a large majority stating that the SNP would, quote, not engage in any more dealings with assemblies, devolution, or any meaningful talks. That was how the SNP entered the 1980s. In 1979, having voted to bring down a Labour government and put Margaret Thatcher in power. Nothing to do with any talk of assemblies or devolution or meaningful talk. But Nicola Sturgeon would have us believe, hey, her party always backed the principles of devolution. Bunkum. Absolute bunkum. It's a reinvention of her own party's history, and we can see it here in black and white. Now, so much for the claim of right and the SNP's insistence that devolution is this lovely thing. It just doesn't, oh God, shucks, work. It does work, but the SNP don't want it to work and have never wished it to work. Of course, that's not stopped the SNP trying to bring themselves into the picture as the defenders of devolution. This is a little thing that went by the wayside that rather relates to the unbelievable claims of the Scottish National Party today about devolution, democratic deficits, and themselves suddenly miraculously becoming champions of devolution and the Scottish Parliament, which, as I've showed you just now, they opposed, they didn't want anything to do with it, and they refused to sign up to the very things like the Bill of Claim, the Claim of Rights, that they now are apparently in 2022 citing in their own argument. This is what the SNP are doing in our schools today. School lessons featuring SNP logo and independence campaign. This is in our schools. Our children are looking at this. And here we are, Nicola Sturgeon, lovely cartoon picture of her, very friendly, big SNP logo. My name is Nicola Sturgeon and I'm the First Minister of Scotland. I'm leader of the Scottish National Party. I'm the first ever woman to take on both roles. I'm campaigning for Scotland to become an independent country. Big logo of the SNP. You can even, they were even given a mask to cut out. Isn't that cute? Oh, here's the father of Scottish Parliament. Here's the man who did more than anyone to actually give us a parliament. Which party is he? Oh, doesn't say. How curious. What does it say? My name is Donald Dewar and I worked in politics for a very long time. I worked for the government. I first worked for the government in London. I campaigned for Scotland to have the power to make their own rules in their own parliament. And when the people of Scotland voted for this in 1997, I became the leader. I was the first ever First Minister of Scotland. Scottish National Party. Big logo, campaigning to become an independent country. Donald Dewar, the father of the nation. No references to which party he was. Complete attempt to conflagrate Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP as the heirs to devolution, as part and parcel of the Donald Dewar legacy of devolution, which, as I've showed you, is a Liberal Democrat and Scottish Labour tradition. It was Scottish Labour and the Scottish Liberal Democrats with the claim of right and the campaign for a parliament. That was the home rule the SNP opposed. That is what the SNP wanted nothing to do with. That is what they said they would have nothing more to do with. What they said was they wanted independence, nothing less. And here we are with Nicola Sturgeon in this classrooms, engaging in the most appalling nationalist propaganda and misrepresentation of the history of devolution and Scottish governance. It's tawdry in the extreme and makes me rather angry. But hey-ho, let's keep going. Time is against us. What we can say now is, let's take a pit stop here. SNP have always opposed devolution. They wanted nothing to do with it. They viewed it as akin to appeasement. Independence, nothing less. We will have nothing to do with the parliament or discussions for devolution. That was them in 79. They said that when they brought down a Labour government, brought in Margaret Thatcher, who, like them, also wanted to have nothing to do with any discussions about a parliament or devolution. Another relationship between the SNP and the Tories. How about that? We've already seen that the SNP today are now desperately trying to reinvent their anti-devolution, anti-Scottish Parliament, anti-Home Rule position in the most tawdry fashion, even in classrooms, with Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister, SNP logos, trying to insinuate that Donald Dewar was actually, SNP. So it's absolutely appalling. And it demonstrates the obsequiousness of the SNP's document. For them to be talking about the democratic renewal of Scotland can only be achieved through independence. Well, that's so far been predicated on a nonsense about the unlimited power of Westminster. And it's also been predicated on the nonsense that devolution can't work, whereas the truth is the SNP don't want it to work and never have ever wanted devolution to work. Now let's move on to the last piece of this puzzle before we go on far too long. This bit here. The Scottish government is committed to respecting, protecting, and strengthening Scotland's democracy. Well, I laugh because the issue I have here is that we know the SNP love to talk about what powers they don't have. This whole document is about what powers we don't have. But what they don't mention at all is anything about accountability, control, reforming political systems of devolution, local government, policing, all these aspects, law and order, all institutions of the rule of law, everything about this is just not even addressed in this document. But we're talking about renewing our democracy. But we don't want to talk about local government. We don't want to talk about accountability. We don't want to talk about systems that would encourage more transparency and openness. It's ludicrous. It's absolutely incredible that this, I'm expected to take this document seriously. But why would the SNP not wish to talk about any of these things? Well, an example might be this. The SNP are the party of centralisation. The very thing that they're accusing Westminster of being a centralising, malevolent force, unaccountably sucking all power and decision-making into it, overruling every other level of power in political system. It's exactly how the SNP govern. They centralised the Scottish police force. That's one example of the power grab. This centralisation that the SNP have oversaw at the expense of accountable politics in our democracy. And what we see now, 14-year low of police numbers, 3rd of May this year. That centralisation went really well, didn't it, First Minister? What does the opposition say? Quite correctly, we already know that local authorities have been forced to cut the number of officers because of SNP budget cuts. Oh. So the SNP are centralising power and cutting budgets. How does that help renew our democracy? Do we need independence before we can do anything about that? No, we just need a new government in Holyrood that will reverse the SNP's centralisation and reverse their budget cuts. Speaking of budget cuts that the SNP don't want to talk about, the reason they don't want to talk in anywhere in this document about local government in terms of renewing our democracy is because the SNP have cut £937 million from our local government within 8 years. This was published in 2021, March. If you take into account the new budget that the SNP announced this year in 2022, which imposes cuts and austerity again on local governments the length and breadth of Scotland, what we see is probably about £1 billion of cuts in real terms to Scottish local government. That is the SNP have been accused of neglecting and mistreating Scotland's local councils. Of course, nearly £1 billion in 8 years cut from local government. No wonder the SNP don't want to talk about renewing democracy in Scotland in reference to sustainable funding for local government or reform of council tax or anything to do with local government, because the SNP have imposed Freddy Krueger cuts on Scottish local governments. Of course, they don't want to talk about that either. But we can round all of this up with a very important piece in this document here, page 10, down at the bottom, page 10, here we go. This is McCorkindale again. He actually outlines in this paragraph here all the ways we could renew Scottish democracy, and none of it requires independence. What are some of the things we could do? Well, what about rethinking the structures of the Scottish Parliament and how the exercise and scrutiny of power in Holyrood works? Does the Scottish Parliament need, as the former presiding officer Tricia Marwick suggested, a second chamber to provide independent and detached scrutiny from Nicola Sturgeon's government to make it more accountable? The SNP don't talk about anything to do with reform of that nature in their document about renewing democracy. Mayo, we don't have any of that. Do the SNP talk in their document published this month about renewing Scottish democracy by maybe empowering the unicameral system by maybe having more MSPs, expanding the chamber that does exist, so that maybe a backbench culture where SNP backbenchers will hold an SNP government to account robustly, in the same way as you see in Westminster. Backbench Tory MPs robustly holding a Tory government to account. We've just seen Boris Johnson brought down by his own backbenchers. Such is the strength of the culture of the backbencher in Westminster, which is non-existent in Holyrood. The SNP, do they talk about renewing our parliament, expanding it, maybe more MSPs, second chamber? Nope, they don't mention any of that. How about this? Maybe the SNP, since they're talking about renewing Scotland's democracy in a big document that have had 20 civil servants working on at God knows how much money, maybe the SNP have talked about reforming the committee system so that it's more accountable and it works. No, we don't have anything to do with that either. Now, why would that be, Dean? Well, the so-called Salmond inquiry, the inquiry into the mishandling by Nicola Sturgeon's government of sexual harassment claims against the former First Minister, who was found not guilty at the trial. That demonstrated in most frank terms that the Scottish Parliament's committee system is toothless, doesn't work, doesn't hold the Scottish government to account, and there's a clear blurring of lines in terms of the Lord Advocate, the powers of the committee system, the lack of the parliamentary immunity for MSPs so that they can speak freely, power to compel, all of these questions, which were so catastrophically exposed in that utterly disastrous inquiry, because of the SNP, I should add, not because of the MSPs like Jackie Baillie or Alex Cole-Hamilton, or Murdo Fraser. They all did a fantastic job doing the best they could. But what I'm saying is that whole episode, that whole fiasco demonstrates that if you're going to talk about renewing Scottish democracy, let's talk about strengthening the committee system in Holyrood. Let's talk about maybe having more MSPs so we could have a vibrant backbench culture where Parliament backbenchers hold governments to account. Let's maybe talk about a second chamber. So there's a second layer of accountability, another hurdle for legislation to pass that's maybe detached from the executive within the legislature, i.e. the Sturgeon government in the Parliament from the legislature. The SNP don't talk about any of that. In this document about devolution and Scottish democratic deficits, it's woeful. And I'm quite animated about it because it's built on a pack of lies about the nature of Westminster being this fantasy sovereign unitarian system, which it's not. I've showed you academic receipts for that. It's built upon this myth that the SNP, oh shucks, would love devolution to work, it just doesn't quite get there. That's not true. The SNP have opposed devolution, never wanted it to work. I've only ever seen it as a means to an end subsequent to the 1997 landslide Labour government. And in terms of the actual ways we could renew our democracy, local government, decentralisation of power, reforming the committee systems in Holyrood, openness, transparency, accountability, nothing, zero. The SNP's publication about renewing Scottish democracy being possible only through independence, it doesn't talk about any of it. And we know why, because the SNP are guilty of projection. The centralising government of Westminster that they hate. Projection. Utter projection. And the austerity. Projection. The idea that centralisation can only be reversed to unleash the potential of Scotland with independence is just nonsense. It's all nonsense. It's an absolutely appalling document. So I hope that was a little bit enlightening for you. It digs into the woefulness of the utter woefulness of the SNP's Renewing Democracy publication. Is dire. I've read it so that you don't have to. I wouldn't recommend wasting your time. It's absolutely abysmal. Anyway, the next episode, we'll dig into more detail in this series about social attitudes. What do Scottish and English people actually think about social issues? And is there this divergence between Scottish and English political cultures, which demands the need for independence? We'll dig into that in episode 3. But for now, I wish you well and adieu.